And at 28 minutes past 9, let's tell you about this. We'll be talking about intra-Africa trade in just a moment. But here's a story that's been of interest that we've been covering, and that is the third country deportations. The United States now deporting 10 people to Eswatini, despite human rights groups in southern Africa, in that kingdom in particular, preparing legal action to block the move. It's the second batch of deportees that the Trump administration has sent to Eswatini under its tough immigration policy. According to Eswatini's prison department, the 10 deportees have been securely accommodated and pose no threat to the public. But human rights advocates are outraged. Human rights groups say the move raises really serious questions about Eswatini's commitment to due process, asylum protections, and the rule of law. We speak about this now to migration lawyer Craig Smith. A very good evening to you, Craig. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me, Trapiso.
So tell us about the latest deportations. Has there been any clarity this time around who would have approved them?
Well, remember, this all emanates from Donald Trump's very restrictive immigration policy. And specifically within the immigration policy, we are dealing with that of asylum seekers and failed asylum seekers who cannot demonstrate that they are genuine asylum seekers or are excluded asylum seekers based on a criminal background. So obviously the US would do background checks when they are vetting these applicants, amongst other things. And at the end of the day, if these asylum seekers are turned down, they would generally have the right to appeal the decision, and that would allow them to stay the deportation of back to their countries of origin. So what we have is a restrictive immigration policy, which has been carried out by the Trump administration, which has been endorsed by the Supreme Court in the US. And effectively, what they're doing is they are trying to what I would say these are facilitated deportations, because many of these countries don't necessarily want these immigrants back, and obviously America is finding a way of paying for this facilitation to a third country. But there are a number of things that the US government is doing to, on the face of it, not breach various international instruments. So, for example, you cannot, under refugee law, what they call refoulement, or send back failed asylum seekers to their country of origin, and that's it's in our legislation, it's in the American legislation. So America is mindful that it doesn't want to be seen to contravene international law. So it is easier for them to then implement this third country deportation. The problem that you have, and which many of the advocates and human rights advocates in these countries, we're dealing not just Eswatini, we're dealing with Uganda, South Sudan, Ghana, is that, for example, Eswatini has a constitution. And in the constitution, you would have your legislative branch that makes the law, and you would have your executive branch that implements the law. So when the Eswatini government has endorsed a cooperation with the US, and it's estimated that they are going to make about $5 million in exchange for 160 failed asylum seekers, the reality is that you will have the executive failing to what they would say rather overreach the law, which is safeguarded by your legislature. In other words, immigration will not simply be a matter where your government can decide who's coming in and not, because it may be contrary to the law and rule of law. And in this case, the human rights advocates are saying it's not for government to make these decisions because they're actually effectively contravening the law,
Okay,
and that's
so
unacceptable.
let's go back to that original question then. Given what you've just said, Craig, because these human rights lawyers, in fact, we spoke to them, said when the news broke of the first deportees, it was clear that even the prime minister had no knowledge of it, and government said as much, that the approval did not go through them. So, how is this then being done?
It's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer. Look, the Trump administration is hell bent on their immigration policy and giving effect to the policy. The relationships that are then brought together between Eswatini and America or all these other countries, a lot of that negotiation is not that transparent. In fact, I don't know if there's any transparency, and it's very difficult to determine or ascertain what the ingredients are, what the terms are of that collaboration between the two countries. I mean, the reality is this, that ordinarily a country would not be wanting to take in criminals from another country when they themselves may be suffering their own issues or have their own human rights poor human rights track record. It is mind-boggling why a country, let's take Eswatini, why would they want $5 million? Could it be the money? Could it be trade terms? Could it be the tariffs? Could it be infrastructural spend? Where the government says, well, you know what, we're doing the people of Eswatini, we're doing not a disservice, we're actually making a contribution. But one never knows. I mean, it's not as if the countries have a fantastic human rights record where there's total transparency. So you are going to have these human rights activists who are going to say that what has actually taken place is, well, they would speculate and obviously look at it in its worst possible light that someone's benefiting from this, but whether the people of Eswatini are benefiting is another story.
And that leads me to my next question, which, as I was thinking about it, raises the important thing, because you were saying, what would that 5 million US dollars be for? And most pointedly, who does it go to? Now, I'm wondering if we're saying Eswatini has obligations under international law, particularly international human rights law and refugee law. Can you please explain to me the definition, either through the international courts or even domestic law, of what then is human trafficking?
Well, effectively, if you are moving persons into a country against their will and contrary to the laws of those countries, but it doesn't necessarily, just to say, it doesn't have to be human trafficking. It could be any adverse risk to your country that's contrary to national interest. But let's just say it's human trafficking. Um, no country will, on the face of it, openly engage in collaboration with America, or let's just say another party who's seeking to do human smuggling at any price. However, no one knows what the government's agenda is. It's almost like dangling the carrot of the money. Is America buying, paying for someone to do its dirty work? And those countries are vulnerable and susceptible to making deals with Donald Trump and his people. America is very smart. You can also say that America is also wants to bolster its presence in Africa. I mean, you have the East who have wished to focus on Africa. This is another way in which Trump can also embolden his reach in Africa. So you have politics. But look, at the end of the day, ordinarily, any country's immigration policy would never take South Africa. You're not going to allow criminals to come into your country. They are excluded from entering your borders. So, in a similar way to human smuggling, in the same way of sending these individuals who have criminal convictions, um, you would ordinarily not allow them, the law would not allow them in, but why is the government allowing them in? And I will say this, that what America is sidestepping is the breach of international law. Because if they were simply wishing to send them back to Venezuela or Jamaica, Vietnam, where Laos, where some of these people came from, you would be potentially contravening international law and refoaling them, meaning sending them back against their will to a country where not only they may face harm, but um, as asylum seekers and persecution, but they may return to face degrading, torturous conditions. So there's a lot at stake, and sort of America has this way of sidestepping being singled out as breaching international law.
So, in this case, and this is a final question, do these individuals have a legal status of some kind or the other? Because if they're not nationals of that country, or whatever crimes that were not committed in that country, when they arrive in a country like Eswatini from another country, I'd imagine even the crimes are not specific, because it seems America is saying they're not dangerous, but we don't know exactly why they're being moved there. Do they have a legal status?
No, they would have absolutely no legal status. It's almost like they're ghosts. They are not even legal ghosts, where you you may come into a foreign person may come into South Africa in the hope of a status. Yeah, people who have artificially been moved from A to B, and the B surroundings and environment is completely unusual. They have absolutely no right of stay whatsoever. So they're literally being confined, and they will be confined in probably atrocious conditions, um, whilst they have absolutely no say. So the question would be, for the human rights lawyers, you've now got to you have these individuals um, who are not Eswatini citizens, who are not Eswatini visa holders or rights of temporary residence. They are just ghosts. And that's the biggest risk, where the rule of law, both in America transgressing rule of law, and now the Eswatini government potentially contravening rule of law within their own country. And this is what upsets these human rights lawyers. And when you are a ghost, you're sitting, you are so susceptible and so vulnerable to be taken advantage of. And I think that's the unfortunate, degrading consequence that America has created, because they want to wipe their hands of the matter. And it all emanates from a very restrictive policy. Of course, this never happened under Biden's administration.
Okay.
It's really now, which is really unfortunate.
Well, we thank you for your time and insights, Craig Smith, who is a migration lawyer. It brings the time to 18 minutes to 10.